I'm going to remind you and remind myself that we're here to hear Dr. Samuel Joseph, who returned to Montserrat last July. And when I asked him, would he consider presenting the annual St. Patrick's Lecture, he promptly agreed. Actually, I had two young PhDs who wanted to give the lecture this year, but one lives off island. So I went with the one who was on island. And hopefully next year we'll have the other one. Now he has chosen to speak on the topic education, the key to unshackle us from the bonds of economic slavery. But perhaps you would like to hear a bit more about Mr. Joseph, Dr. Joseph. He studied at the Cave Hill campus of the University of the West Indies, graduated with honors in 1999. He went on to study computational physics. He did an MPhil and completed that in May 2001. His dissertation is entitled Self-Organized Criticality and IF Noise in the Back Model. I hope I'm pronouncing this thing correctly here. He did a diploma in high energy physics in Italy and completed that in 2002, August. His dissertation or paper, Cosmological Evolution and the Renormalization Group. One of these days we'll sit down and you'll explain it all to me. In 2004, he started his doctoral studies in physics at Baylor University in Waco, Texas. He worked as a research assistant with his advisor, assisting with calculations and programming related to his IR improved DigiLab theory. And he completed his PhD in 2009. The title of his dissertation, Monte Carlo Simulations Using Infrared Improved DigiLab CS Theory. Now he has worked as well, even though he's very young. He has had some work experience. In 1995, he started at the Montserrat Secondary School teaching maths and physics, and he did that for a year. Then he went to Cave Hill, and he was a teaching assistant for a period, 1999 to 2001. He tutored physics students in introductory mechanics, optics, electromagnetism, and circuit theory. He tutored math students in pre-calculus, calculus, and algebra, and coordinated and graded first-year labs, and graded tests and assignments. Actually, my niece remembers him at secondary school, and he said, he's excellent. From September 2004 to September 2002 to September 2004, he served as a graduate teacher at the Montserrat Secondary School, where he piloted A-level physics and prepared students to write overseas examinations in CXC and CSEC in mathematics and physics. Then he returned to Montserrat in 2010, as I told you, last July, and formed Montserrat's first software company, LavaBits, with his brother, Danny Joseph. Danny, could you please stand? And their friend, Manish Valecha. So these are the three young partners in the company, LavaBits, and we're looking forward to seeing wonderful things from LavaBits, because Dr. Joseph tells us that in his spare time, he's programming and creating applications. You've submitted two, and you've submitted them to whom? To Apple? And Montserrat is going to be getting the benefits of all of this. This evening, Dr. Joseph will be talking about education. And I know that you're more interested in listening to him than listening to me, so I'll call Dr. Joseph to the podium. Please welcome him.
Good evening, all. I crave your indulgence by just stating that the protocol has been established. Some of you all may not know, but the Deputy Governor, Sarita Francis, taught me geography when I was in fourth form. So there's a connection between here. Now, before I start, there's a part of my talk where it mentioned I went to Italy. During this trip, I went to an institution called the ICTP, which stands for the International Center for Theoretical Physics. This center was set up by a Nobel Prize winner in physics, Abdul Salam. He worked on something called the Standard Model of Particle Physics. He came from Pakistan, then he immigrated to Cambridge, where he worked on this theory with Glasgow from America and a guy, Steven Weinberg, who's now at the University of Austin, Texas. The three of them received the Nobel Prize in physics. What he realized and what he argued is that there's a difference between the wealth between the North, the developed countries, and the South, the underdeveloped countries. And his basic point was that this difference is due to a difference in technology and science. It's not the gap of wealth and the society between the North and the South is basically is a technology gap. And if you close the science and technology gap, you'll also close the economic and wealth gap. To institute this policy, what he tried to do was to form, he said, the problem, when you're in the third world and you're doing science, how do your universities don't have the resources, you don't have the money to pay for the journals, which are very expensive, to get the labs. So he tried to get funding from the United Nations and from Italy. He finally got the center set up to the United Nations and the Italian government. He set up an institute in Trieste, Italy, called the ICTP, where the basic idea was to take talented scientists from the third world, bring them there on 6-month assignments where they can interact with the top scientists from around the world, from Princeton, MIT, etc. So they'll come for 6 months, have access to all the necessary resources, then go back to their country to try to bring back science and technology to the third world. So I went to that, somehow I got into the back door. So he started something for the students. He basically picked 10 students from around the entire third world for high-energy physics, 10 for something called condensed matter physics, and 10 for mathematics. And they just started 10 for computer science. So it's 40 people total throughout the third world. When I went there, a lot of my ideas are going to come from his book that he wrote, Ideals and Realities. But when I went there, 2 major things happened I discovered. The first one is that there's only one way to say this, and it has to be said, that in the Caribbean and the way how we do work, the idea of working 8 to 4 and believe that you're doing work is not how it's done. Working from 6 to 11 is what it means when you're doing work. So I realized in order to compete with the people in MIT and Princeton, it's only one way it can be done. You're going to wake up at 6, you're going to work all day, you're going to discuss physics during your lunchtime and during your coffee break, and you're going to go home at 11. That's how it's done. That's the first thing I noticed, but that's not what the talk is about. The second thing that occurred when I went there and I sat in my first electromagnetism, quantum electrodynamics class, and the professor from Iran went to do his calculation. It's the first time in my life, anyway, it's the first time in my life I sat down in a class and did not know what was happening. So there was just random gibberish on the board, which I guess is how my physics and math students feel. Hopefully not. But anyway, it's the first time I realized that I did not know what was happening. But there's a mentality, and it's a mentality that we in Montserrat need to have, and it's a mentality that we in the Caribbean need to have. He explained it, and there were clearly people in the class that understood it. So the mentality is simple. Did somebody in the class get it? The answer is yes, therefore I can get it too. So it's not a matter that Montserrat is small, or other Caribbean islands did this, or America did this, or England, or Australia, or Japan did this. If they did it, it has been done, we can do it. It's very simple. You could have given up, I could have given up and go home, but that wasn't the mentality. In the end, obviously, I graduated. So it can be done. And the other thing I noticed from that, there's a sort of disease that a lot of people have. It's called saying that they do work and mistake the saying that they're doing work with the actual doing of the work. They're not the same thing. So a lot of people get a maths homework, and you ask them how much work have they done. So they say they bought this book, How to Solve Quadratic Equations. They read it. They went on YouTube to watch a video, how to solve equations. And then they said they've been doing work for the entire week. But at no point did they ever take out a paper, a pen, sit down, and actually do the work. There's a difference between talking about something and doing it. And it's a disease a lot of people have. You all know who I'm talking about. Various such people. That's the same thing, like you meet a beautiful young lady, you want to approach her. So you're going to read books how to date women out of your league, where to meet women in Cosmo or whatever. But you have to put down the book and go and say hi. If you want to, so whether you're a student, if you have problems to do, write up to the assistant, the acting governor, and there's a difference between talking about doing something and doing it. At some point, you'll take out your paper, put down the pen on the paper, and do something. So his point was, keep that in the back of your head, is that Abdul Salam, the difference between the North, which, if you look at it, the northern part of the globe, which has England, America, and Canada, and this country, and the South, is due to a difference in technology, in our view to science, in our view to knowledge, how we treat science, how we treat research, and how our society is structured to take advantage of people with this knowledge. It's not an economic problem, it's partly a political problem, but the main issue is a knowledge problem which can only be solved through education. So as a country, if you want to move your country forward, there's only so much public reform you can do, there's only so much things you can do. At some point, your country has to produce something. For it to produce something, it has to have an education system that produces the people and the human capacity to produce such items. So that's basically going to be my contention. So, well, I had an introduction, but so, as I said, and as was said, my training is in theoretical physics. So, but my lecture is not going to be on theoretical physics. At some point, there's certain things that you feel that need to be said, and somebody needs to say it. So I'm going to be that person. So, in the 1600, Montserrat, the residents of Montserrat, as was read by Miss Castle, found itself in a situation that they really had, an economic situation that they really had no control over. So they would produce their labor, and this labor was for somebody else. The type of house that they needed to build was determined by somebody else. Their sleeping hours, etc., was determined by other people. The general term for this, as you might know, is called slavery, where you did not, the capital that they needed to use did not come from them, the landowners had it. There's a system of, an economic system called capitalism, which is one of the greatest wealth creation mechanisms that the world has seen. The basic idea is that you start with some capital, you have some product you want to develop, you get some means of production to do the product, you sell it, you make a profit, you take this profit, you invest back into your business, etc. As a slave in the system that you're in, you had no control over anything. You were basically the means of production. You were the factory. So you needed some way in order for these slaves to get wealth or to free themselves from the state that they were in. They needed some way to escape from this. So the telegram that she found, we actually found it, the actual copy. So on that St. Patrick's Day, some people decided, you know what, the state that we're in cannot be maintained, and we need to do something about it. So they hatch a plan. One report says that they believe they stored armaments in the mountains. Another report came and said no such thing was done. But the point is they decided that they were in a specific state, they could not maintain the state, and somebody had to do something. So Groveland decided on St. Patrick's Day, while they were celebrating, the landowners were celebrating St. Patrick's Day and further occupied, they would attack and try to get their freedom. Unfortunately, this plan was given off by a woman. The article never said whether it was a slave woman or one of the, I was trying to determine it, but I couldn't guess. If it's a slave woman that gave out the plan, or it was given out by somebody part of the Irish plantation. The point is somebody in the system gave out the plan. So if there's a phrase, keep that in mind again. If you have something to do, whether you think it's the best thing for the country or for yourself or to go along, there is always going to be somebody that has some vested interest to maintain the status quo. But if you're in a situation and the status quo cannot be maintained, somebody has to make the sacrifice and push it forward. So they decided to, it didn't work. But eventually, anyway, in 1834, the eventual proclamation was passed to free the slaves. Actually, it was only slaves under 6 were freed. The rest of them were called apprentice. And then the final proclamation was in 1st of August, 1840. So on that day, everybody was free. The question being, free to do what? They were free to keep working for the landowners. That's what they were free to do. Since they had no capital, you're now free. What are you going to do? You still have no capital, you still have no control of the factories. And so basically, in that terms of Montserrat history, you're free in itself that nobody legally owns you, but you're not technically free because you still need to work for the very same landowners. So there has to be a system that, if you talk to people from back in the day, that either every third of your ground belongs to the landowner, so you have to give them that, plus work for in their factories and get paid wherever they decide to pay you, or various other systems like a third of what you own belongs to them. So unless you actually own capital or own part of the land or some means to invest it for yourself, there's no way they could have advanced their state. So after slavery, these are some of the pictures of Montserrat post-slavery. After slavery, even though technically they're free, my argument and contention is that you're not really free because your life and your production, everything that you produce, is not for your benefit, it's for the landowners. You're still not free. That was eventually you all recognize these pictures? Any of them? You should recognize the bridge at the top left. So on the bottom right is William H. Bramble. Eventually, there was a system where Montserratians were able to own their own land. From then onwards, because they now have their land, they now have capital, means of investing, the state that Montserrat was in, these buildings at the top left, the system advanced economically, and in some sense, we became more free. So the argument is, are we now free? And if we're not, how do we get out of that state? So, if you look at this map shows the global GDP per capita of the world. What you're interested in is the dark colors. You realize the dark colors are centered in the top, basically America, Canada, Western Europe, and Australia. The rest of the world, if you look at the green, that's only $1,000 per year, the GDP. And most of Africa, the bottom part of Asia, the Philippines, and most of South America. The world has a disparity where you have the very rich and the very poor. And my argument is that we're still in economic slavery. All of our work, all the things that we do are not really for ourselves. We are working still for the same colonial system, and we haven't escaped from it. So, according to the British Medical Journal, which was published because they had some various goals that they were trying to achieve for the year 2000, so there are a lot of organizations that went through, look at all these world debt figures. For the world poorest countries, debt burden is the new slavery. Jubilee 2000, a coalition of over 90 organizations, including Oxfam, Christian Aid, and the British Medical Association, is demanding that those financial chains are broken as a celebration of the new millennium. So even from 1999, they realized that there is a problem with the world where you have such disparity of wealth between between the various countries. That's from the British Medical Journal. Now let's look at some of the data. Now, the developing world spends $1.3 on debt repayment for every $1 it receives in aid. So when we believe we're receiving aid, you're giving it back. You're paying 30 cents every time they give you a dollar. So take the Nigeria example. They borrowed $5 billion. They have already paid back 16 billion, but they still owe 28 billion. That's the nature of the world that we live in. That's because of the credit interests that were given to them by the World Bank, IMF, and such other evil organizations. You borrow 5 billion, you paid back 16 billion, but you still owe 28 billion. Now, 52 of those countries, 1 billion people need to pay back 286 billion pounds. It is interesting to note that if you add up the wealth of the top 21 people of the world that can pay it back. So these top 21 people of the world currently, that was done in 1999, had more money. It's even worse now. It's now spreading out. Has more money than 1 billion people put together. That's the world we live in. So in 1999, 128 million was transferred from the poorest countries to the richest for debt repayment each day. That's not a year. Every day, the poor countries pay back to the rich countries $128 million. 53 million of that is from East Asia, 38 million from Asia and Pacific, and 23 million from Africa. Each day, that's what they pay back to basically the G8 countries. So the idea that we have somehow gotten ourselves from slavery, and when we produce cotton and sugarcane to send our wealth back to these countries that we are out of it, we are not out of it. You are still in the exact same situation. Your labor is to maintain the lifestyle of the first world. So, they realize such things, and various groups get together in various declarations and try to pass various resolutions about what needs to be done. One of them was done in Rio, and there's a Rio declaration which reads, "Developed countries, by and large, have shown remarkable reluctance to initiate and support change. Having derived much of their wealth from cheap resources and raw materials of developing countries, they still refuse to give access to their markets to third world countries. They refuse to recognize the inevitability of modifying their lifestyle and scale and patterns of consumption, and maintenance of which requires a disproportionate share of the world resources. They have used the power provided by science and technology to pursue policies shaped by selfish interests over the world's ocean, and they are squandering a vast fraction of mankind's resources in scientific power, as well as material in stockpiling weapons of mass destruction." The document then goes on to say that the struggle of the third world is for economic liberation, greater equality of opportunity, and securing the right to sit around the bargaining tables as equals with a redistribution of future growth opportunities. That's the declaration that they made just before, when people realized what was going on. It's not a matter of redistributing the wealth, is redistributing future growth opportunities and the realization that you obtain your wealth based upon the exploitation of the third world countries, and now using the same economic systems to maintain the same system without, I guess some people realize it. So, when you realize what's going on, sometimes you feel like, "Our love could thou and I with faith conspire to grasp this story scheme of things entire. Will not we shatter it to bits and then we mold it nearer to the heart's desire?" So the question is, how do we achieve this? Let's go back, ignore the history of our part of the world. Since when you talk about our part of the world, there's always the excuse made, is because we were under slavery, why we are in this situation that we are on. So let's look at East Asia, which has a different history. If you compare in 1660, there were two great monuments that were built at the world at the same time. One was built in India, the Taj Mahal, and one was built in Europe, St. Paul's Cathedral. This is 1660. If you look at the two structures, you realize that the the advancement in terms of architecture, design, and building skills were pretty similar. So these two structures symbolize the comparative level of architectural technology, the comparative level of craftsmanship, and the comparative level of affluence and sophistication that these two cultures attained at the same time in history. So in 1660, if you look at go back, just look at their buildings and their technology, you realize at that time in history, there was really no difference between what we now consider Western Europe and what we now consider the East. If you now compare the two places, you realize that they're vastly, vastly different. So what happened in England after 1660 that did not occur in Asia that caused such a big rift? They had the same technology, they had the same, basically same government system, yet after 1660, if you now compare in 2011, I think we're in, you realize there are vastly two different things that happened. What happened? My contention, and a lot of people's contention, is that it was changed in July 5, 1687, by the publication of a book by Sir Isaac Newton, Philosophy Naturalis Principia Mathematica. It was basically 3 books that were published on mechanics and physics. There's a big debate that's going on in various history and other fields, which I won't mention. Why is it that this work came out of Western Europe and appeared nowhere else? What the work basically did, established modern science. What we had, you might argue that the Aztecs and the Egyptians and the Taj Mahal had science. They didn't really have science, they had business, they had building technology and various other such things. If you had asked them like a simple question, if you drop something from the top of the Taj Mahal, how long will it take to hit the ground? They will not be able to answer you. What Newton did at that time was to show that one can use mathematics to explain the physical world, that the physical world is actually governed by, you could write down a mathematical equation that has some kind of correspondence to what's going on in physical reality. This idea did not take place in any of the other civilizations. There are things by trial and error, building technologies, you could see the stars moving around, and by plotting it over a period of time, they could have predicted what was going to happen. But they had no understanding of why the earth goes around the sun. Yeah, right. Why the moon goes around the earth. They really didn't have such they knew it happened, and because of observations, they could tell you what's going to happen next. They really had no mathematical way of determining why it happened or a theory behind. Newton changed all of that in 1687 by the publication of these works, and also his works on calculus, plus some other quack works that he did. He established modern science, the idea that by studying the world, we can find mathematical equations that can describe what happens. We can then use these mathematical equations and shape the world to our will. So when both countries discover gunpowder, and I build a cannon, and you build a cannon, and I know by calculation which angles to use, and you are doing it by trial and error, I'm going to win. So the Europeans spread across the world and eventually made contact with the Indian civilization at that time, which was at that time, that part of the world which we now call India, Pakistan, Bangladesh were governed by the Mughal Empire, which, as you realize by the construction of the Taj Mahal and various such things, they were a very organized society. But Queen Victoria's army was able to defeat them. So about 100 years after, in 1757, the superior firepower of Clive's small arm inflicted a humiliating defeat on the Mughals. By 1857, the remaining Mughals were forced to relinquish the crown of Delhi to Queen Victoria. The English language replaced Persian as the language of Indian state and learning. Shakespeare and Milton replaced the love lyrics of Hafiz and Omar Khayyam. The British, after they took over, established 31 liberal high schools in India, and this is the key, but just one single college of agriculture and engineering. I mean, you could predict what the end result of this. So when they came and they set up back the education system, they had 31 high schools and only one technological college that has to deal with engineering and agriculture. And we're still having an argument why we need a technical college, but we'll get back to that. So what was the end result of that policy of having in your country no system where your indigenous people can invent their own technology and you have to import technology from overseas? India missed out on the chemical revolution in fertilizers and pesticides. The manufacturing crafts dwindled and died. They were advised against building steel factories. If you want steel, you could always buy it from England and America. Why are you wasting your time building steel factories? So if you want a plow for agriculture, we're going to sell it to you at our price. So basically what they were supposed to do was to produce cheap commodities, sell these commodities to the first world countries, they're conquering power. Those countries now would then send you back the technology which you are to buy. Call it market economics. So that's what was supposed to be set up. This system, as history showed, bankrupted India. That's the point. That's one of the points I want to get across. If you have a system which does not at some point produce people to get things out of that system and you're importing technology continuously into your country, you will go bankrupt. So basically they were to sell commodities, which is the same error for whatever reason, political, financial greediness that the Caribbean got into. After slavery, URI was only established when? Like in 1960s. Yeah. But officially, when it split from University of London. When they're connected to the University of London. They officially split. So that was in 1962, which is just the other year. So we sold out prior to that because we did not have the internal capacity, whether human capacity, to develop our own bauxite mines, our own oil refineries in England. You basically sold out the rights of these to multinational corporations because, as a Caribbean, we did not, could be argued, either we did not or we did not appreciate that we have people with such capacity. So then we sold out all our things, our resources to these other countries and now have no manufacturing capacity. So we send out our bauxite and import the aluminum. Because we, as I'm going to argue, we did not have the human capacity internal to the Caribbean or belief that we had such people who could do it. It's one or the other. You could debate why. And the other issue that I'm going to have to discuss is the issue of commodities versus manufactured products. Because I realize, it's a strange thing, in the Caribbean and in Montserrat, there's always this thing, let's sell stuff, not let's manufacture stuff. It's never in the conversation. You could argue that we don't have the manufacturing capacity or that we're that small, but that's not the point. The point is not even in the conversation. So if we have sand, it's let's sell sand, not figuring out what the other people are doing with the sand and make it ourselves. Either we believe that we don't have the capacity, or it could be true that we don't have it, but we need to then get institutions and systems in place to get the capacity. We cannot keep exporting commodities and importing back the manufactured products. There has to be a belief that we as Montserratians, as Caribbean people, as the people in the South, do have that human capacity, and if we don't have it, we have to set up institutions to get it. Otherwise, we're going to remain in the same situation that we are in. So we'll take, for example, just before the year 2000, when all this analysis was done. A bushel of corn you sell for $4. When you buy a bushel of cornflakes, you buy it back at $133. Which part of the equation do you want to be on? That's the question we have to ask. We could keep talking about how we used to sell cotton and how we used to sell lime juice, but unless we start talking about how we're going to make t-shirts, we are going to keep selling our corn for $4 a bushel and keep buying back the cornflakes at $133 and enriching the same colonial powers on the hard work of Montserratians and Caribbean people. And we need to somehow get out of this thinking. So, as Michael Manley stated, in 1950s, 10 tons of sugar bought a Jamaican farmer a Ford tractor. But in 1970, 20 years later, you think the price would go up. It now requires 25 tons of sugar to buy the same sugar. The same tractor, sorry. The question is why? And his argument was the Jamaican peasant is subsidizing the social security and welfare of the Ford plant worker. The price of cars hasn't gone down. I guarantee you, if you check from 1950 to 1970, the price of cars have gone up, but the value of your product has gone down by twice. You need to get out of this thinking about commodities. There's commodities and manufacturing. You have to get out from selling your corn from $4 and buying back the cornflakes for $133. And if you don't believe that we have the human capacity to do it, as I said at the beginning, the thinking how I think and the thinking how everybody needs to think, somebody did it. If somebody did it, we could do it too. And we have to repeat again, we have to stop selling corn for $4 and buying back cornflakes at $133. You're not going to go anywhere. So I said UE was set up, as I said, in 1940s. It finally became independent in 1960. That's a whole other topic, so we won't get into that. So let's talk about something else. To serve the human resource needs of this island, the Montserrat Community College was established in September 2004. Amazingly, this had various degrees of opposition. Sadly, there appears to be no appreciation, nor need for the role of indigenous science, technology, and human capital. So, we can, as I said, take steps and actions to liberate ourselves from the economic servitude that we currently find ourselves in. As Lyndon Johnson stated, there is no simple solutions to this problem. In the past, there would have been no solutions at all. Today, the constantly unfolding conquest of science give man the power over his world and nature, which brings the prospects of success within the purview of hope. So before, we could have argued that there's maybe no way out of the situation that we are in. And I'm saying that there is a way due to science, technology, the accumulation of knowledge, the appreciation for human capital, and political systems in place to take advantage of such people and such information base, which I'm going to get to. So, that's part one. All of this is going to lead us to the issue of sustainable development, which has become a big talking point lately, because Montserrat needs, as was stated by various people whose names elude me, that we need to learn to feed ourselves. So at some point, the question of sustainable development comes up, and the question then becomes, how do you move forward in terms of sustainable development, and what actions need to be taken such that this comparison, which is somewhere behind me, is made? What steps can be taken? Debates on sustainable development generally focus on politics. The rich countries assume that we are poor because of poor policies and corruption, this whole transparency issue. Policymakers from rich countries perceive underdevelopment as a battle against corruption, wrong ideas, and incompetence. These rich countries make some fundamental mistakes in their approach to sustainable development for poor countries, which they then impose upon us. And to regain control of our destiny, we must avoid these errors. This is the picture of the United States GDP from 1950 to 2010. So that's US gross domestic product GDP history from 1950 to 2010. This is the graph that you're aiming for. The question becomes, how did USA achieve this graph? I see there's a big financial crash at the end of the, of the table. What happened between 1950 and 2005 that caused such a graph? International agencies such as the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and the World Bank failed to give the required credit to technological advance as a driver of the economy. They generally regard economic progress as a result of market forces. In 1987, the winner of Nobel Prize in Economics, Robert Slow, demonstrated in 1957 that the great bulk of US economic growth in the first half of the 20th century was the result of technological progress rather than the accumulation of capital. Science-based technologies have driven and are driving the economic growth of rich countries. It has enabled them to produce bountiful food harvests and to have dramatic increases in their mobilization of energy. Markets were a factor, but so was the public investment in scientific research, higher education, and the diffusion of technologies. Why do you mention that? Because the argument then is, we are not America, and we don't have the capacity to form MITs and Princetons and Caltechs and to fund multi-million-dollar a year scientific research organizations. There's certain problems that the third world, Montserrat, face that other countries don't face. If you take, for example, agriculture. If you add up the amount of money like allocated to research in tropical agriculture, it's a minuscule number. But then when you then go and look at companies like Monsanto, which is an American genetic agricultural company, Monsanto spends $600 million a year on research. That's one company. So we have Montserrat. We move to the north. There's an argument that the land is not the same, so that's a problem. There's other arguments about the rainfall, so that's another issue. So you now face a scientific agriculture, biology, biochemical problem. How do you become self-sustainable in Montserrat to import your own food? What methods should you go through to solve such an issue? Consider this. The last time I checked, which was today, I made sure I checked, we have a PhD biochemist at the Montserrat Community College. Yet at no point during his tenure was he ever contacted by anybody to ask advice on the situation that we currently face. And you have to ask yourself, why is it things like that occur? Is it that we undervalue our human capital? There's a very real problem that we have in the third world countries, so we import the solution. Or do we not understand the significance of science and research? Or do we believe that the problem is not solvable? Or that it's okay to keep on importing food? Or that nobody can do it? And that's a question that needs to be answered. Maybe it's a problem at the tertiary level, and it's solved. Our agricultural farmers are going. So maybe we have realized the issue, and we have solutions in place that are coming up from the Montserrat Secondary School. So maybe if we look at the Montserrat Secondary School, we will realize that the various parties responsible for education and such things realize the situation the country is in, and have made the necessary investment and plans to solve this issue. So you need to take a look at what's happening at the Montserrat Secondary School. It's a conspiracy. Anyway, the pictures supposed to be the pictures of the current agriculture equipment at the Montserrat Secondary School. Now we have like 5 shovels, 2 pit axes for the entire school from 1st form to 5th form. And these are the children that we're training to then produce the necessary agricultural solution to the island. So they're what? They're in 15. So you have to ask yourself, in 10 years, if you project forward based upon our investment in education and human capital, where do you expect to be? If you do not want to make the necessary investment now in this research, in the science and technology and the human capital, in 10 years, where do you expect to be? Let's move on. Let's look at Japan, which is another country unaffected by slavery. Japan was run by various feudal lords, various shoguns, prior to their contact with the Western invaders. But they were basically this emperor, the Meiji, that took over, and he made certain vows. So what I'm going to argue basically is what Japan did. There's also examples about South Korea who took the same path. But in interest of time, we'll do Japan. So there are 2 prerequisites necessary for a nation to escape the captivity of poverty: skills and capital. There is, however, an even more important criterion: the political resolve to do so. There are 2 prerequisites necessary for a nation to escape the captivity of poverty: skills and capital. There is, however, an even more important criterion: the political resolve to do so. According to Professor Rosto, a nation take off into sustained growth awaits not only the buildup of social overhead capital, that's capital invested in communication networks, schools, technical institutes, etc. It not only awaits a surge of technical development in agriculture and industry, but it also needs the emergence to political power of a group prepared to regard the modernization of the economy as a serious high-order political business. So this was the case of Japan in 1868. The Meiji Empire came into power, and he made certain oaths. There are 5 ones, but we go to the 5th one. There's other ones about the quality of people, how you treat people, getting rid of old ideas that stop progress, which we should go to. But let's go to the 5th one. The 5th oath that he made was that knowledge will be sought and acquired from any source with all means at our disposal for the greatness and security of Japan. He made this oath in 1868. He decided that Japan was going to move away from the feudal agriculture system that it was in. Remember, at that time, Japan was at the same level as China, the same agrarian type feudal system. He made an oath in 1868 that that's what he was going to do. Knowledge will be sought and acquired from any source with all means at our disposal for the greatness and security of Japan. So, to carry out this strategy, they had various things that they do. I'll just go to them quickly. In the short term, they imported foreign engineers and scientists. For the medium term, they sent students overseas and set up colleges. For the long term, and set up universities and various research institutions. A lot of emphasis was placed on technical education. Remember that phrase. A lot of emphasis was placed on technical education. They primarily taught practical subjects like engineering, agriculture, medicine, together with the supporting subjects like mathematics, chemistry, and biology. They expanded their base of scientists and engineers. By 1937, they were powerful and advanced enough to attack and defeat Japan and to come all the way China and to come all the way across the Pacific and launch an attack on Pearl Harbor. So by 1934, we had Datsun and such companies established in Japan, moving from an agrarian society By 1934, they were at that stage in their development because they decided as a nation that's what they were going to do. There's a difference, again, between talking about something and doing it. So the question that the point that I'm making is that to advance, we need to invest in our education. So throughout this lecture, I'm making the implicit assumption that we invest more in our education, we are going to see economic growth. But why should you believe such a thing? So there's this understanding that if a country spends more on education, incomes are going to grow fast enough to recover this investment. So there's an unspoken idea that education investment will foster technological innovation, therefore making labor and capital more productive, generating economic growth. Also, it's assumed that education can assist in the transmission of new knowledge and technologies invented by others, therefore, again, promoting economic growth. But what evidence do we have to support this contention? I mean, it's just talking. What are some of the factors that one must take into consideration when analyzing the correlation between economic growth and education? So you want to check if is it really true that if you spend more money on education, that there's some correspondence in your economic growth. It seems obvious, and when you get the data and you plot the graph, you're going to see if you spend more on education, your economic growth goes up. That does not really mean that, because two things are correlated, which means if two things are connected, it doesn't mean that one caused the other. Every time it rains, it's connected that outside is wet. There's a direct connection. But because you go outside and see outside is wet, it does not mean it rained. It could have put on your sprinklers. So because you spend more on education and you see your country growing faster, it doesn't mean it came from the spending on education. It could have simply meant that because your country got richer, it now has more money to spend on education. So when you do the analysis, you have to remember, you can't just look directly at the graph. So, also, most data that collected prior, when they had the education millennium goals and such things, they look at the years somebody spends in school and then compares it to the education. That has certain inbuilt things, because it's counting a year in kindergarten as the same as a year in a doctoral program. It's also assuming that 5 years of education in Montserrat is the same as 5 years of education in France. I mean, there's no reason to believe such a thing. Obviously, we're better. But so they're making such assumptions, so you need some way to get away from that things and actually look at the actual data to see what happens. So, for personal earnings, it's known that the higher your education level is, the more money you're going to make. That's on an individual level. So the better you're doing math is the more money you're going to make. That's why you all need to study. So there's a direct relation between your score in mathematics and what you're going to eventually earn throughout your life. But that's on a personal income level. It's possible that you left Montserrat, went to America, and made that money. What does it have to do with Montserrat economic growth? We need to compare the data with the country's economic growth. This is this data done in 2002 by these researchers shows on the bottom scale, it has the years in schools, and at the axis going up that way has the country's economic growth. If you plot it, it seems like the more you go to school, is the faster your country is going to grow economically. It appears that way. But what they're going to argue, the writers of this paper, the two factors that I mentioned, you can't just look at the amount of years somebody goes in school and there's a reverse problem. Which one came first? But they basically argue that the key factor that drives economic growth and nation development is not access to education, but depends ultimately on the ability of schools to foster the cognitive skills and to facilitate the acquisition of professional skills. It's not just, which you keep hearing, to make sure that all your children have access to education. Giving everybody access to education is not what's going to drive your economic growth. It's the quality of the education that they receive. So this idea that we just need to keep everybody in school because it's for the betterment of the country. It's for the betterment of people who want babysitters. It's not. The research shows it's not the access to the education that makes the difference. It's the quality of the education that matters. Therefore, the education development strategy of a nation should not only focus on sending more children to school, but more so on maintaining and enhancing the quality of schooling. So they went and tried to find some way of measuring the cognitive skills of people. Because you can acquire these skills from home, from church, from your interaction with people. Most of the skills you actually acquire in life have absolutely nothing to do with school. That's a bad statement to make, but it's true. You don't remember most of what you learn in school. It's true. You acquire the skills that you need to come work at 8, sit down, follow orders, and follow a certain procedure. If there wasn't school, it would be hard to organize a society. Because you need people to understand that you must come to work. There's a structure of people above you. You take orders from them, you produce reports and things, and you give them, and your society functions. Most schools, that's what it does. He also teaches you to sit exams. But that's a separate issue. When it actually... So they did, and there's an international Pisa test, I think Montserrat should do, which compares the children's performance in science and technology at the age of 15 and 16 across the various countries. So they took the results from these tests and argued that these results in science and math give some indication of somebody's cognitive ability. When they looked at, so this is test scores that they're using. And again, if you compare this graph, this other one is jumping around. If you compare the graph with the students' test scores in this Pisa test and the nation's growth, it's almost a straight line. The higher the children perform in this exam is the faster the country's GDP growth is going to be. If you then go back, what they did here now, as I said, you have to be careful when you factor in how long the people stay in school. If you take that out, the cognitive skills score out of the model, you realize you get a flat line. It's not the time you spend in school, it's what you learn in school that matters. It's not just sending people to school. It's make sure when they go to school, they learn something. So does it matter if it's a developed country or a developing country? So the first one is for poor countries. Peru, Morocco, Brazil, and these countries. Again, you see for the poorer countries, the better they do in the math and science tests is the faster the country's GDP grows. You try the same thing now for the rich countries, the richer countries. It's the same thing. Even for the rich countries, the better the children do in science and math is the faster the country's GDP growth. There's a graph with the number of lawyers, it goes the other way. The more lawyers they have, is the slower your country grows. That's an actual fact. So the question then becomes, what's the best way to improve education quality? Counterintuitively, as it seems, it's not simply a matter of providing more resources. If you provide more resources and you don't change the fundamental structure of the system, it does not matter. If you're spending bad money on a bad system, it does not matter how much money you spend, the children's scores are not going to move. What the research shows, there's only one thing that has been found to move the children's scores, and it's the quality of the teaching. Therefore, if you're serious about moving people's test scores, you got to improve the quality of the teachers. Find and retain the best teachers. Therefore, the necessary incentives should be provided to acquire and retain the best available teachers. And this decision cannot be made on public whim, race, gender, or nationality if we are serious about moving the children's schools. That's all that needs to be said there. The greater danger there's certain goals that I don't know, whether they're set or they're rumored to be set. And our own ministry seems to have taken this quote to heart. That the greater danger for most of us lies not in setting our aim too high, but in setting our aim too low and achieving our mark. So they have set certain aims. What one hopes that they realize that one of the corollaries that derive from the connection between school quality and attainment is that actions that improve school quality will necessarily boost attainment goals. So if you set these goals and you have this thing that you don't want to set your goals too low and you want high goals, if it's true that improving educational quality, improve children's scores, improves your country's GDP growth, if you're serious, then one should see the necessary investment to change the education quality. That's the connection I will make. If you don't see it, there's certain conclusions I will draw. Although this may involve major structural changes, it does not follow that adding more resources is going to change the system. It's not just a matter of adding resources, not a money issue. There are other issues. Anyway, there's a document that's available on the government of Montserrat websites. So one important conclusion that we could draw from the data was that once there's a high-quality school system, it pays to keep the children in school longer. But it does not pay if the school system does not produce the necessary skills. In sum, the evidence shows that the quality of education measured by the knowledge that the students gain, as depicted by a test of cognitive ability, is substantially more important for economic growth than the mere quantity of education. So, as I said, there's this document that we can all find on the government website. It's a publicly available document. We should all read. Government of Montserrat Ministry of Education towards a new education development plan. I guess they didn't like the old one, for 2011 to 2020. So let's examine certain of the data that's in this plan. At the beginning of the plan, they said the plan asks stakeholders within and outside the system, the education service, to determine the goals and outcome of the new plan. So I guess I'm part of the stakeholders. So I'm going to comment on it. So let's look at this first data. This is Montserrat. So this is spending on education in Montserrat compared to the regional averages in comparing the region in 2007 and Montserrat in 2010. Government spending on education broken down into primary and secondary. The blue line is the Caribbean and the red line is Montserrat, the red bar. As a percentage, so it's not just raw numbers, as a percentage of our GDP, we spend half as much on education as the other Caribbean islands. So the money is spent elsewhere. We have to ask ourselves where. As a percentage of the GDP, we spend half as much in Montserrat on education as the other Caribbean islands. Keep that in mind when you're, as I said, the document asks the various stakeholders to make comments. The document states it's not to say what should be done, but just to present evidence so that the various stakeholders can discuss the step forwards. So, when everybody here is prepared to make their comments, remember this information. We spend half as much as a percentage of our GDP on education. But, as I said, it's not just a resource issue. Because if you compare, if you do the analysis of a school educational system, when you actually do the data and the system already set up, if you just go and just spend money on it, you're not changing anything. So it's not simply a matter of saying let's increase the amount of money we spend on education and we are going to see results. Also keep that in mind. It's two issues. The structural changes that must take place. There's another big part of the document that I find interesting. This is the performance of students who earn 5 CXCs or more as a percentage of the entire school population. So it's not just those that sit the exam. If you don't sit the exam, you're counted in the statistics. So you're comparing it between boys and girls. And if you realize, as a percentage of people that pass CXCs, they have twice as many girls that do it than boys. That's a big debating point, why this is and what needs to be done to rectify this problem. They go to the same school system. When they finish 5th form, the test that they use to determine success, which is, in some sense, 5 CXC passes, the girls will do twice as much better as the boys. And there's questions about why that is. Well, obviously I have certain ideas why I think that is. Not the full picture. But if you're a boy and you go to MSS and they tell you to do woodwork, and you go to the woodwork lab and there's no wood, what do you want them to do? And when they go into the elect room and there's no wire, what do you want them to do? So when you have a system set up, in some sense, that the subjects that boys would choose generally, why are you surprised at the end result of the thing? I mean, you should know that what's going to happen. You shouldn't be surprised. You should see it and say, yes, that's what we expect. Now, how can we fix it? There should be no surprise. So when they have to, certain subjects, agriculture, woodwork, and elect, and the science subjects, where the teachers have to grind vitamin C tablets to get ascorbic acid to do the experiment, what results do you expect? At least they'll have a big wide road to get to school. At the end of the report, it didn't say, but it basically concludes that because in our system, 75% of our work is done by the public service. And since the boys don't graduate with 5 O-levels, they're not suited for employment within Montserrat. So the unemployment rate within boys in Montserrat is, in that age group, 15 to 25, is way higher than girls because they don't graduate with the 5 O-levels that the public service requires for employment. So it was suggested that something should be done to fix the problem. But this is a fundamental mistake. The scientists, the technologists, and the technicians are in the main products of the educational system, not of the industrial system in which they hope to work. A coherent demand for technical education facilities will not rise from assortment of industries, but the existence of technically trained people will facilitate the growth of new technologies. In other words, you can't look at what you currently have and say we're going to train people to put in it. You have to look at what you want, and then we're going to train people to create this. Hold on. In the conditions of modern life, the rule is absolute. The race which does not value trained intelligence is doomed. Today we maintain ourselves. Tomorrow science will have moved over yet one more step, and there will be no more appeal from the judgment which will be pronounced on the uneducated. I thank you.